In 1989, in Bangkok, Thailand, Billy Idol went on a drug-fueled binge after a breakup that spiraled out of control. Later admitted the trip involved heroin, alcohol, and heavy tranquilizer use, leaving him erratic and destructive. He reportedly trashed multiple luxury hotel suites, leaving behind severe damage and hundreds of thousands of dollars in unpaid bills. The situation soon escalated to the point where authorities were forced to intervene. Billy later said he was tranquilized and strapped to a military stretcher before being carried out and deported, with the Thai army reportedly involved in carrying him out. Idol has since described the incident as one of the lowest points of his life, driven by severe drug abuse and a reckless lifestyle that nearly destroyed him. In 1999, in Towanda, Pennsylvania, 11-year-old Adam Herman disappeared from his adoptive home. No missing persons report was filed at the time. For years afterward, his adoptive parents told family he was returned to state custody, while continuing to claim him as a dependent on taxes, legal filings, and collecting adoptive subsidy payments. In 2008, after his adoptive sister tried to reconnect with him as an adult, she discovered records falsely showed he had lived with the family until age 18. She then reported him missing nearly a decade after he vanished. The adoptive parents were later convicted of fraud for collecting thousands in payments after his disappearance, but no one has ever been charged in connection with what happened to Adam, as his fate remains unknown. This was the moment an MMA fighter was forced to face off against an aggressive dog. When a large unleashed pit bull suddenly charges straight at him, he reacts quickly, putting the dog in a headlock while keeping its jaws away from his face and neck. He stays calm the entire time, controlling the dog's movement on the ground like he's in a match. Luckily, the dog had a weak ground game. A few seconds later, the owner finally shows up and manages to control his massive dog. The guy walks away completely unscathed, and it's pretty clear his wrestling background is the only reason this didn't end much worse. In 2024 in Minnesota, an 18-year-old driver reported that his Honda Pilot began accelerating on its own and wouldn't slow down, even when he used the brakes and emergency brake. The SUV reached speeds over 110 miles per hour and continued for over 20 minutes, crossing into North Dakota while the driver remained on the phone with 911. As he was approaching a dead end, authorities coordinated a controlled intervention, using police vehicles to safely bring the SUV to a stop without a high-speed crash. Miraculously, the driver was not seriously injured, and the incident ended without any fatalities, though the cause of the malfunction has never been determined. 2 days before his death, he said this:
"Every day that I have on earth is a gift and a blessing, and I'm very grateful for that, because frankly, people are disappearing, scientists are going missing. Now they're saying they're going to investigate this. The president himself is saying they're going to look into this and see if anything's going on. It's a little bit scary."
That was David Wilcock, a paranormal author and Ancient Aliens contributor, known for claims about UFOs, hidden technology, and government cover-ups. In the video, he referenced a series of recent deaths and disappearances tied to researchers and scientists in space, energy, and defense fields that he and many others believed were connected. Just 2 days later, on April 20, 2026, in Colorado, deputies responded to a crisis call. Authorities said Wilcock was found outside with a weapon and died shortly after police arrived. His death was officially ruled a suicide. In 2019, aboard the Disney Dream in the Atlantic Ocean, a 5-year-old girl climbed onto a porthole railing for a photo and fell nearly 50 feet into the ocean below. Her father jumped in after her seconds later, hitting the water hard before swimming to her and keeping her above the surface as the ship drifted on. With no flotation device and surrounded by open sea, they remained in the water until crew launched a rescue boat to pull them out. Both miraculously survived as the girl was treated for hypothermia, while her father suffered serious injuries, including a fractured spine from the impact with the water. On March 4th, 1994, beloved comedian John Candy died of a heart attack at the young age of 43 while filming for Wagons East in Durango, Mexico. Candy long feared he would suffer the same fate as his father, who had also died of a heart attack at a young age. After years of struggling with weight issues, heavy smoking, and earlier drug use, Candy died in his sleep in the middle of production for the film. His death stunned Hollywood, and he was so beloved that when his body was returned to Los Angeles, police took the extraordinary step of shutting down the notoriously busy 405 freeway so his funeral procession could pass uninterrupted, a tribute typically preserved for presidents and other heads of state. On September 24, 2005, Mark Dixie spent his 35th birthday drinking at a pub in London before walking the streets with a knife. In the early hours of the morning, he followed 18-year-old Sally Bowman as she returned home and stabbed her repeatedly outside her own front door. Her body was discovered just steps from safety. Dixie evaded arrest for 9 months until he was involved in an unrelated pub fight, and his DNA was entered into the national database, where it directly matched evidence from the murder scene. In 2006, he was convicted and sentenced to life in prison with a minimum term of 34 years. Ingrid Pitt, best known for her roles in 1970s British horror films, was born in Guszka Petrov in Warsaw, Poland in 1937. During World War II, she and her mother were arrested and sent to Stutov concentration camp, where prisoners constantly faced starvation, forced labor, and executions. At one point, they were taken into nearby woods to be killed, but managed to escape amid the chaos. After Pitt later became a recognizable figure in British horror cinema, she suggested in interviews that surviving the Holocaust gave her a different relationship with fear, allowing her to portray terror and vulnerability on screen in a way that felt more grounded and real compared to typical performances in the genre. Exotic Adrian Street was a major figure in British professional wrestling in the 1960s and 70s, building a flamboyant, androgynous ring persona that later inspired artists like David Bowie. In 1971, he was booked in a staged exhibition wrestling match against Jimmy Savile, a TV personality who would occasionally step into the ring for publicity. Savile was already rumored behind the scenes to be prolifically abusing children, something the wrestler was aware of. Instead of playing along, Street turned the match into something real, aggressively grabbing Savile and ripping chunks of his hair out in front of the crowd. Decades later, after Savile's death exposed hundreds of victims and confirmed him as one of Britain's most prolific predators, that wrestling match took on a much darker meaning. What seemed like a wrestling stunt was one of the only times someone openly confronted him, while authorities and institutions were ignoring or failing to act on the horrific abuse. Sorry in advance for this one. What the hell's wrong with people, man? In July of 2023, a 31-year-old man identified in reports as Mr. Liu was admitted to a hospital in China after experiencing severe abdominal pain, sweating, and signs of infection. You probably know where this is going. Doctors discovered he had inserted a live eel into his anus, which then forced its way through his rectum and colon. The eel used its sharp teeth to bite through his intestinal wall, causing a perforation that allowed bacteria and fecal matter to leak into his abdominal cavity, triggering life-threatening peritonitis. CT scans showed the eel moving inside his abdomen before surgeons performed emergency surgery. During the operation, they found the eel had punctured through the colon and entered the abdominal cavity. The eel was removed and the damaged sections of intestine were repaired, while surgeons cleaned out contamination to prevent further infection. He survived after intensive treatment, but doctors noted that without rapid surgical intervention, the injuries would have quickly led to organ failure and an extremely painful death. In 2024 in Los Angeles, California, 23-year-old YouTuber Tumad, whose real name was Medea Siddiq, was found dead inside his home after a welfare check was requested when he'd gone silent for several days. Authorities discovered his body in a state of decomposition, indicating he had likely been dead for some time before anyone realized. The death was later linked to a suspected drug overdose, with reports of substances found at the scene. In the months leading up to his death, Tumad had posted increasingly erratic and concerning content online, including references to drug use and disturbing behavior. Despite having millions of followers and a massive online presence, he died alone unnoticed until the smell coming from his residence prompted concern. Donald Miller disappeared in Ohio in 1986 to escape debt and alcoholism, and was declared legally dead in 1994 so his ex-wife could collect Social Security benefits for their children. Years later, he resurfaced and appeared in court in 2013 asking to be declared alive again. The judge ruled that under Ohio law, a death declaration cannot be reversed after 3 years, meaning that despite standing in the courtroom alive, Miller was legally considered dead. As a result, he was left unable to get a driver's license, Social Security number, or legally work, effectively existing outside the system with no clear way to reverse his status. Here's an incredible look at a 2,000-year-old Roman aqueduct that still carries water today, hidden beneath the ruins of Smyrna Agora in Izmir, Turkey. This ancient underground channel was built during the Roman Empire to supply the city of Smyrna with fresh water. Using carefully engineered stone tunnels and gravity alone, Roman engineers directed water from nearby hills through passageways beneath the city. Remarkably, parts of the system still function nearly 2 millennia later, with water continuing to flow through the same channels built by ancient Roman engineers. Ferdinand Postman Cheval was a French mailman who spent 33 years building an enormous stone palace using nothing but the rocks he collected on his daily route. With no architectural training and only a wheelbarrow and simple hand tools, he worked night after night to assemble columns, towers, archways, and sculptures into a dreamlike structure he called the ideal palace. For the longest time, people in his village thought he was eccentric, but the finished palace was so extraordinary that France eventually declared it a National Historic Monument. This was the moment a man desperately tried to force his way through a secured airport door after claiming he needed to see his dying father immediately. On January 1st, 2024, 30-year-old Kyler Effinger breached security at Salt Lake City International Airport after forcing his way through an emergency exit and running straight onto the restricted airfield. Effinger had already checked in and had a boarding pass for a flight to Denver, but for reasons that remain unclear, he suddenly bypassed security procedures and ran straight onto the tarmac instead. He told staff he was desperately trying to reach his father, who he believed was dying. Moments later, he ran across the airfield and climbed into the intake of a Delta Airbus A220 engine, while the aircraft was parked on a de-icing pad with the engine still rotating. The spinning turbine quickly pulled him in, killing him almost instantly from catastrophic blunt force injuries. Police later found his mangled body partially inside the engine. Kyler's grieving family later said he'd been experiencing a severe bipolar episode at the time. In 1995, 15-year-old Elise Poller was lured to a remote eucalyptus grove in California by 3 teenage boys she knew from school. But what began as a planned meetup quickly turned into a brutal attack. Elise was stabbed multiple times and strangled, and her body was hidden in dense brush where it remained undiscovered for months. The case finally unraveled when one of the teens confessed to his youth pastor, who contacted authorities and led investigators to her remains. During questioning, the boys told police the killing was part of a satanic ritual that would help their struggling death metal band gain success. They specifically claimed they needed to sacrifice a virgin, a detail that shocked the community and drew national attention to the case. All 3 were convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to decades in prison. In recent years, 2 of the men have been granted parole while the other remains in prison, a decision that's reopened old wounds in the community nearly 3 decades later. Just last week, a college party clip blew up online after looks-maxing streamer Clavicular got brutally frame-mogged by an ASU frat lord standing beside him with zero effort, the camera angle draining his aura in real time. The posture diff locked him into a ruthless side-by-side that spread across feeds like wildfire. The moment triggered instant cortisol spikes and total aura collapse, while the frat leader named Varys leaned into the attention, jester maxing across campus and dropping the nonchalant gimmick that made the clip go viral. Themes across the internet quickly flooded the timeline, going full goon max over every micro-expression like it was a historical artifact, reposting the same frozen frame until it became the only canon version people recognized. Edits kept looping, glaze levels stayed high, and the posture diff turned into permanent lore. What should have been a forgettable party interaction became a snapshot the algorithm refused to let die, slowly reshaping Clavicular's image into a meme defined by one cursed angle. In honor of Part 9/11, here are the most morbid facts I've ever posted about 9/11. In 1983, professional climber Dan Goodwin illegally climbed the North Tower of the World Trade Center. He said he was trying to bring attention to the inability to rescue trapped occupants of the upper levels of skyscrapers. In August of 2001, actor James Woods reported 4 suspicious men on his flight, but authorities didn't take his claims seriously. Turns out there were 4 of the hijackers who would go on to crash into the World Trade Center, and this was one of their test runs. Afghan resistance leader Ahmad Shamu Sood warned about a major terrorist attack that was about to happen on U.S. soil, but he ended up being assassinated just 2 days before 9/11. An FBI counterterrorism expert John O'Neill urged the federal government to take the threat of Al-Qaeda more seriously, but he was eventually pushed into early retirement due to disagreements with the Bureau. He went on to head security at the World Trade Center, where he was killed on 9/11. Seth MacFarlane and Mark Wahlberg were both booked to fly on American Airlines Flight 11, the first plane that crashed into the World Trade Center. But Wahlberg decided last minute to fly to Toronto instead, while MacFarlane missed the flight by 10 minutes due to a hangover. Released in June of 2000, video game Deus Ex didn't include the World Trade Center in its skyline due to technical limitations. The in-game explanation was that they were destroyed in a terrorist attack. In August of 2000, the band Dream Theater recorded a live studio album called Live Scenes from New York. The album cover art features the New York City skyline with the Twin Towers on fire. Most disturbingly, the album was quickly pulled from shelves after coincidentally being released on September 11, 2001. Only one non-military plane was allowed to fly after all commercial flights were forced to land. It was delivering anti-venom to a snake handler in Florida who was bitten by the highly venomous Tibetan snake. Sculptor Michael Richards was killed in his art studio on the 92nd floor of the North Tower on 9/11. His art ironically focused on planes, including a sculpture of airplanes piercing a cast of his own body. This iconic photograph of 28-year-old Marcy Borders covered in dust was taken just after the World Trade Center collapsed. Marcy was a bank teller who worked on the 81st floor of the North Tower. She survived the collapse but sadly died from cancer in 2014, likely caused by the toxic fumes she was exposed to. The only off-duty NYPD officer who was killed in 9/11 had signed his retirement papers that morning. But instead of leaving his badge, John William Perry decided to pick it up one last time. Here's a photo of Pork Chop the search dog receiving fluids and comfort before returning to his duties. Many 9/11 rescue dogs were becoming depressed because they weren't finding any live bodies. Rescue workers had to constantly bury themselves to trick the dogs into thinking they were actually saving someone. Tanya Head was a well-known 9/11 survivor who faked being in the South Tower during the attacks. She served as president of the World Trade Center Survivors Network for years until it was revealed she wasn't even in the country on 9/11. Known as the Meteor, this was the result of 5 floors of the World Trade Center being compressed together after the towers collapsed. It's not known if there are any human remains inside. Long after the cleanup, body parts were still being recovered. In 2006, the arm of a victim was found on the roof of a nearby bank. And as recently as 2013, fragments of human remains were discovered on top of a Manhattan rooftop more than a decade after the attacks. In 2002, a 15-year-old boy became inspired by the terrorist attacks on 9/11. He decided to steal an airplane and fly it into a building in Tampa, Florida. It ended up only damaging one office room, and he was the only person that died. Since 9/11, more than 40,000 people have been diagnosed with cancers and chronic illnesses linked to the toxic dust released when the towers collapsed, a debris cloud made up of pulverized concrete, asbestos, fuel, and materials from office equipment and lighting systems. More first responders have died from 9/11 related illnesses than on the actual day of 9/11. Even nearly 25 years after the attacks, victims of 9/11 are still being identified. In 2025, 3 more people were named through advanced DNA testing using tiny fragments recovered from the World Trade Center site. But of the 2,977 victims, 1,100 of them still have no identified remains. In December of 1988, Hollywood cameraman Bob Samuels, whose credits included Short Circuit, The Color Purple, and Beverly Hills Cop 2, was found shot to death in his Northridge home, killed through a pillow used as a crude silencer. Investigators later accused his estranged wife, Mary Ellen Samuels, of arranging the murder to collect a $500,000 life insurance payout. Afterwards, she was said to have spent lavishly, including a Cancun trip where photos surfaced of her posing nude with large amounts of cash. Prosecutors also alleged that when the hired gunman began cooperating with authorities, she arranged for him to be strangled before he could testify. She was ultimately convicted for her role in the conspiracy and sentenced to life in prison. In August of 1993, 6 Kazakhstani hikers died during a trek through Siberia's Khamar Daban mountain range. The only survivor later told investigators that members of the group suddenly began screaming, bleeding from their eyes and ears, foaming at the mouth, and clawing at their throats before collapsing one by one on the mountainside. Official reports ultimately ruled most of the deaths as hypothermia, with the group leader reportedly dying from a heart attack. But the survivor's description of the final moments has kept the incident controversial, with theories ranging from altitude sickness and poisoning to extreme weather exposure. Between 2014 and 2015, Ohio woman Brittany Pilkington was responsible for the deaths of 3 of her children, all infant sons, over a 13-month span. The first child's death was initially ruled a case of SIDS, but suspicions grew after a second infant died under similar circumstances. Doctors briefly considered a possible genetic condition, and despite investigations, the youngest boy was returned home only to also die a few days later. One of her children, the only daughter, was never harmed. In police questioning, Brittany confessed to deliberately smothering all 3. She described restraining the older one by holding his legs during the struggle until he went limp after a few minutes. As investigators dug deeper, they uncovered a long history of trauma surrounding the family. Brittany was repeatedly beaten by her biological father as a child, and even worse, her husband was her former stepfather, whom she said had groomed and sexually abused her starting at the age of 9 before she eventually married him as a teenager. In 2018, she pleaded guilty to 3 counts of murder and was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Researchers off the coast of Tenerife have captured extremely rare footage of a black sea devil. a deep-sea anglerfish that usually lives thousands of feet below the surface, swimming in unusually shallow water. The black sea devil is almost never seen alive in daylight, and scientists say this may be the first ever recorded video of the species swimming near the surface. Its sudden emergence has left researchers completely baffled, since deep-sea anglerfish usually only rise from the depths when they're sick, dying, or pushed upward by shifting ocean conditions. Here's a rare view of the insane intricacies of a computer chip. What you're looking at is a maze of microscopic pathways where billions of transistors switch on and off to process every command a device makes. The structures are engineered at a scale smaller than wavelengths of visible light, pushing the limits of modern manufacturing. Because of how abstract it looks at this level, it's often cited as an example of alien technology. That was a digital recreation of images, since a standard optical microscope can't resolve details that small. In order to actually see structures at that level in video format, you would need an extremely high-powered electron microscope. Here's an extremely rare encounter with the Tibetan fox, an animal most people don't even know exists. The Tibetan fox is one of the least documented wild candids in the world, native to the high-altitude Tibetan plateau where it survives above 12,000 feet in extreme cold and isolation. The fox is instantly recognizable by its unusually square-shaped head, narrow eyes, and thick fur, giving it the appearance of a fox you drew in third-grade art class. Solitary and highly specialized, it relies heavily on plateau pikas for food, tying its survival to a very narrow ecosystem, which makes genuine close-up encounters in the wild highly uncommon. Here's some incredible footage of the oldest person ever captured on film. This is Pope Leo XIII, born in 1810, appearing in an 1898 motion picture at the age of 88. By the time this was filmed, Leo XIII had already been alive for nearly 9 decades. He was born when many people who had fought in the American Revolution were still alive, lived through the reigns of multiple emperors and kings, was already an elderly man during Abraham Lincoln's presidency, and is even older than your mom.